So I was rummaging through the archives and I found this. It's ARP or ARP's Synthesizer Brochure from the 1970s, containing a list of all its current synthesizers, and I thought you might be interested to take a look at it. But rather than just watch me flicking through the pages, I have done my best to scan them as best my scanner will allow, and I am recording this video in HD. So if you want to read the contents on a page by page basis as I show them to you, if you pause the video you should be able to read the text. Now here's the thing, I reckon unless you are a vintage synthesizer historian or Alex Ball, if you are interested in vintage synths, then you probably subscribe to Alex Ball's channel anyway. If you don't, check him out. He produces some fantastic videos on old vintage gear, and he has some videos about the history of some of the companies as well. Okay, that's enough plugs for Alex. But if you are interested in vintage synths, I reckon there will be at least one, possibly two or more instruments in this brochure which you were not aware of, or possibly which you were aware of but had forgotten about. Now, I read this from cover to cover back in the day, and when I was looking through it again now, there were still a couple of synthesizers which I had totally forgotten about. Now, you may be wondering why I have still got a 40-year-old synthesizer brochure. Well, back then, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have computers. The only way to get information about new products and new synths and new releases was with magazines, mainly through reviews and adverts. And of course by popping down to your local friendly music shop and having a look at the gear that they had. Mine was a very rocky place, and when you walked in you would think that they had forgotten to pay their electricity bill. It was like walking into a cave. Most of the assistants were quite friendly, but some of them looked disappointed that you weren't Jimi Hendrix or Herbie Hancock. But I did buy a few synths from them. But apart from that, they were also a mine of brochure information. And no one produces brochures now. I guess it's more eco-friendly. So we've probably saved thousands and thousands of trees. But back then, this was a good way for manufacturers to get information about their products out. So most companies produced regular brochures, and you could pick these up in your local music store. Now, I might have some more in the archive from other companies. If you are interested in this sort of thing, then let me know in the comments and I will see if I can do the same thing with some other brochures. So let's have a look and see what's inside. So this is the front cover, and what I find interesting is that even though we can barely make out any synthesizers, the colour scheme reflects ARP's brown and orange livery. Now some people call it black and orange. To me it looks brown. I may have a colour perception problem, that's quite likely, but to me it has always been brown and orange, and you can see this in the design, so I think that's a super design. Now the brochure doesn't have an actual date on it, but as best I can tell it was probably produced in late 1977 or perhaps 1978 or even later. The reason for this deduction is that the latest synths were released in 1977, so it could not have been produced any earlier. However, I think 1978 onwards is probably a reasonable guess. Okay, let's open it up. So the first couple of pages tell you a little bit about the company and their design philosophy. If you want to read these, you can put it on pause. Moving on, we get the first synthesizer. So these are not arranged in alphabetical order, they are not arranged in chronological order by date of release, and they are certainly not arranged in price order. It doesn't really matter, I'm just pointing that out. So the first synth in the book is the Avatar, which was released in 1977. As you will discover as we go through the book, 1977 was quite a prolific year for ARP. Anyway, the Avatar was ARP's attempt to produce a guitar-controlled synthesizer, which it did using CV and gate voltages. Now, I think the technology was quite difficult to achieve, and by all accounts this was not a very successful module. I think only around 300 were produced. It was released at a price of $3,000, which is a heck of a lot of money now, and it was even a heck of a lot more money back in 1977. Some say it was partly responsible for the demise of ARP as a company, and that may well be true. These are very rare. I don't know if you'd actually want one to use as a guitar controller, but I believe a lot of people who had them and struggled to get them to work with a guitar simply used them as expanders, as they have many similarities with the ARP Odyssey. Now we skip to the second page, which gives you more information about the instrument, and it has this absolutely wonderful diagram with all the controls numbered and listed. I use this brochure as a basis for understanding what synthesis was. Oh, look, it's got a VCO. They're good, aren't they? Yes, VCOs are good. So I used the brochure along with other brochures to discover what the parts of a synthesizer were. So let's have a look at the next one. So this is the ARP Axxe. I love the way they have two X's in it. Now this may or may not be one of the synths which you had forgotten about or simply weren't aware of. It was in fact a cut down version of the ARP Odyssey. Now the Odyssey itself was a sort of cut down and portable modular version of the 2600. So I'm just wondering how much of a synth you can cut away while still leaving a synth. But apparently they still had the same ARP sound, and of course the big advantage over the Odyssey is that it was cheaper. And here's our little diagram of the Axxe with all the numbered parts and a description of what they are. It's a wonderful way to describe your instruments, I think. So let's move on. So here we have the ARP Odyssey, which was released in 1972. The Axxe, by the way, was released in 1975. The Odyssey is one of ARP's best known synthesizers, possibly due to the plethora of clones which have been released in recent years by Korg and Behringer. The Odyssey was essentially ARP's answer to the Mini Moog, which was released in 1970, I think. And it had the big advantage of being considerably cheaper. Like many of ARP's synths, it went through several revisions during its lifetime. Eventually, like all of ARP's synths, I believe, it was produced in the traditional ARP brown and orange colours. And here again is our wonderful layout of the synth with all the parts numbered. So here we have what I think is many people's favourite ARP synth, the 2600, popularised again by reissues from Korg and Behringer, and of course there have been other 2600 clones if you want to know a little bit more about them, and other vintage synthesizers and vintage synth clones, then you could check out this video. I will leave a card up there somewhere and a link to it in description. So this was produced from 1972 to 1980. And like many other ARP synths, it went through several revisions. I think the first one was in fact the Blue Marvin, followed by the Great Meanie, and followed by another one which was sort of grey, but eventually it ended up in the traditional ARP brown and orange livery. It launched at a price of $2,600, and like the Odyssey, which is in competition to Moog's Mini Moog, the 2600 was in competition against Moog's modular systems. And of course this had the advantage of being far cheaper, and also because it was semi-modular, musicians did not have to learn everything about synthesis in order to use it. They could simply use it as it was pre-patched. Now, back in the 1970s, synthesis was a very new thing. So now if you are a musician, you probably have a basic grasp of a subtractive synthesis. If not, I have another video which explains the difference between analog and digital synthesis, which you might want to look at. But back in the 70s, it was very much a learning curve for all musicians. And as well as being a professional instrument, it was also intended for education. And the routing options were listed on the main panel, so I'm sure this helped in education, and I'm sure it helped many professional musicians to get to grips with the instrument fairly quickly. Now let's have a look at the panel and the controls. I think I certainly did get a good education by reading these brochures and looking at the information here. Now the 2600 was definitely one of those instruments I would have sold my grandmother for. Not my Moog grandmother, which I have at the moment, but it was an instrument of great desire, Unfortunately, I couldn't afford one at the time. However, when Behringer released their range of 2600s, I bought one, and if you watch some of my videos, you can probably see it over my shoulder there on the shelf in the corner. Synthesizer gratification 40 years on. So what's this? An ARP sequencer. I had almost forgotten about this, but yes, back in the day, ARP produced a sequencer to go with presumably the 2600. The sequencer was released in 1976. As far as I can determine, there does not seem to be an awful lot of information about it out there on the web. Although maybe I just haven't found it. Now, I really liked the look of this. It is a 2-channel 8-step sequencer, which you can play in parallel, so 2 channels of 8 steps, but you could also link them together to play one 16-step sequence. Now, what I really like about this, instead of the usual knobs which you often find on step sequencers, this uses sliders, and it is far easier, I think, to know exactly where you are, perhaps not exactly pitch-wise, but you know what pitches are on each step in relation to each other, if one's higher than the other or lower than the other. This isn't always so easy to do if you just have a set of knobs. And I love step sequences, so although it was fairly simple, it was something which I really would have liked. And here is the list of controls. Isn't that absolutely wonderful? So moving on, here is the ARP Omni 2. This is one of the synthesizers which I had totally forgotten about. It was a polyphonic string synthesizer, and they were very popular in the 70s and 80s. It was released in 1977. Yes, a very busy year for ARP. It had polyphonic strings and a monophonic bass section. I wasn't quite so interested in this sort of thing back then, although yes, I would have loved a string machine. There were several on the market, but it was all about money. Well, isn't it always? So here's a breakdown of the controls. I think it was probably a very interesting instrument and useful in any synthesizer's arsenal back in the 1970s and 80s. So here is the Pro DGX. This is another synthesizer I had totally forgotten about. It was released again in 1977 and was in production until 1981, when unfortunately the company collapsed. Now this was interesting because it was a preset synth. It contained 30 presets and it had aftertouch. Now apparently this was a great commercial success, although unfortunately not successful enough to save the company. Now I probably forgot about this because I wasn't so much interested in presets at the time. I wanted something I could fiddle around with and make my own sounds with. And here is the list of controls. I think this is wonderful information to have about your instruments, and I think it would be a good idea if other manufacturers followed suit and put information like this on the web. So that is actually all the instruments in the brochure. So looking at the last couple of pages, these are specifications and tech specs. And as I said at the time, I probably read every single word in this catalogue, much of which I have alas forgotten. And just for completeness, this is the back cover. Not much on there except the ARP logo. You can see 2 holes at the top of the brochure. At the time I used to keep my catalogues in a ring binder, so that's where the holes came from. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed looking through the ARP 1970s synth brochure. Let me know if you actually have any of these instruments, please. I'd be very interested, and if you still use them. And let me know if there were any instruments you were not aware of. Also, please do let me know if you enjoyed this and would like to see some brochures from a similar sort of period from other manufacturers, if I can find them in the archives. And if you have enjoyed this video, then perhaps you would like to consider subscribing to the channel and ringing the bell, so you get informed of new videos like this as soon as I post them. But do let me know your thoughts. I'm really interested in what you think. As always, thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you again in the next one very soon.